It's filming right now.
Oh. See, this always happens.
Hello and welcome to Taryn's Study. Today I am here with my good friend David Brandenburg. What is your channel called?
The Man Behind the Screen.
From The Man Behind the Screen. And we are going to talk about character development in stories versus tabletop games.
Yeah. For those who don't know, my channel focuses largely on tabletop games, discussions on good playing habits, good game running habits, and also discussions on things like character growth and how to make characters of certain types, bringing different archetypes that you like into your characters. I even have a full series on there called the Character Showcase, where I will examine characters from movies, books, video games, and we'll look at the elements that you can borrow from in your games to develop a character along a similar story arc. Shall we start with character arcs?
It sounds like a good place to start.
Okay, so your channel, I say, start with you then.
No, when I develop a character, I'm not really sure exactly where I start from. It's kind of like a really organic process. Sometimes it'll have to do with a character I need for like a plot point or something. But always, the character will eventually take on their own life. Mm-hmm. And they'll start doing things where I'm just like, where did that come from? That's not what the plot said we were supposed to do. Because my stories tend to be very, very character driven.
Yeah.
So yeah, usually it just starts with like an idea, and then I become curious about trying to find out who that person is. And usually I find that out by like writing scenes with the character, and sometimes it'll take a couple edits of that scene before I really know who the person is. But yeah, I have to see them in action before I really know who they are.
Yeah. In my experiences with tabletop gaming, it's not that different in that regard. To develop a character that you're playing in a tabletop game, particularly role-playing focused games such as Dungeons and Dragons, Savage Worlds, Pathfinder, what have you, you don't really have the benefit of being able to sit down and plot out ideas for the kind of character you're playing. You can do that sometimes, especially if your GM gives you a couple weeks ahead of time to make your character before you guys start playing. You can definitely do that, but 9 times out of 10, whatever notes you write are going to end up eventually being thrown out the window, because as you play the character, you're essentially improvising. So they're going to take on a life of their own. You're going to start thinking in a mindset differently from your own, and that's going to lead you to places you don't expect. And in my writing too, it's always been the same thing as you already know from, again, for those not aware, we went to college together and actually took the full writing course at Grossmont College together.
4 semesters.
4 semesters. I think I pushed for 5, but the college, I think they let me take 5, but they didn't let me take 6. Yeah.
From my experience with tabletop games, a lot of times they'll start with like a sheet where you fill out certain questions and stuff, which is actually not a bad idea I always skip it because I jump into the story too fast. But it's not a bad idea if you're not sure who a character is to kind of like just ask some questions about where their background is, where they come from.
Yeah. And that's something more recently with the latest edition of Dungeons and Dragons that's become a bigger thing. The previous editions didn't really do that so much, particularly the earliest editions, because those were games where essentially the characters on your sheet, it was very little information. You had your basic stats. From those stats that you rolled up, you could figure out what classes you could play, and then you would create the bare bones basics of a character and not really go much beyond that, because it was such a lethal game that much of the time you'd be going through playing, and then the player you're playing would die. So you'd have to roll up a new character over and over and over. But now with the most recent edition, there is more of a focus on the role play and the character development. So they give you options for different backgrounds, different paths that your character had in life before they decided to start adventuring, which can help to give an idea of the kind of character one wants to play. But one of the things that I've always found kind of tricky about that is there's a bad habit amongst people in tabletop gaming where they will look at their characters, look at the stats on their sheet, and try overly hard to force the character to match with the numbers that represent elements in a mechanical sense of the characters, as opposed to just, hey, play the character the way you want, and if the numbers don't 100% reflect that, that's okay. You don't have to reflect every little digit on your sheet in the character just because you've got a guy who's really, like a barbarian who's really strong and good at swinging his axe, but is dumb as a rock. That doesn't mean he has to talk like, Og Skullcrusher, me kick you face in. You have full range of freedom to experiment the way you want. It's the beauty of those kinds of games. Since it is based on improv, you're only limited by your imagination. And really the same is kind of true of writing a book as well. You're only limited by what you can think up. And of course, what you know. Writing what you know is kind of important too, because someone's always going to point out, if you don't know what you're talking about, someone out there is going to point out, hey, you're full of crap, you don't know what you're talking about.
No, I think that's a really good point though, because it's really easy to get really heady about a character and worry about the background, whereas opposed to like whether you're doing a story or a game, like you're worried about the here and now. So like the background can be important, like to know where the character is coming from and what perspective they have, but it doesn't have to be like present in the present, like 100%. It's like kind of like, you only have to show the tip of the iceberg, and like it's nice to have the whole iceberg underneath all like set up, but you only have to be worried about what the character is doing right then.
Yeah, and that's something very true in tabletop gaming. In my experience, because I've been doing that for about 22 years almost, going on 23 years, since I was 10 years old. And one of the things I've noticed a lot, and something I was very guilty of, and in some ways am still very guilty of, is there are players and dungeon masters alike who will lump a lot of the essence of a character into the background. Well, you're not experiencing the background. You're experiencing what's happened in the game, right here, right now. Same is true of any novel or short story or movie. You're not experiencing what happened to this character before the movie started.
Really heavy on flashbacks, but
unless you're really heavy on flashbacks, in which case your main story is going to slow to a crawl. And why aren't you just writing about the character's past at this point in its own story? But yeah, long story short, so to speak, if you're focused too heavily on a character's background as opposed to what they're doing and the growth that they're making now, well, then you're just playing a stagnant character who's telling people the stuff that happened to them that they've never experienced. That's kind of boring.
It's kind of like Wolverine syndrome.
Oh yeah. Oh, don't get me started on Wolverine. I used to be so into him in the 90s when I was, young and dumb and didn't realize that he's actually a horrible character.
Well, just like he's portrayed as supposed to be like such a mysterious character.
Yeah.
But we know more about what happened to him in his past than any of the other characters.
Including himself. He doesn't even know as much about what happened to him in his past because of the magic of amnesia than the audience does. Which is another problem, by the way. Don't rely on heavily overused tropes. Archetypes are okay. You can build from an archetype, but too much reliance on tropes, like amnesia, Captain Marvel did this too, by the way, and that was a hard sit. Yeah, it's certain tropes are overplayed. You can make them work in writing or in a tabletop game. It's easier, admittedly, in a tabletop game because it's a much more relaxed environment than if you're really trying to write out a well thought out story.
Well, you're also making it up as you go, so
Exactly.
sometimes it helps to have something to.
Exactly, but over reliance on tropes will very quickly damage the enjoyment an audience will get out of a character.
For sure.
Yeah.
I think that's also like cliches. Like, I totally want to do a video about this. Cliches, tropes, and archetypes are all like really related, but also not the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, so a trope you can make work. A cliche is a cliche, and it's like empty, and it's not very real because there's not a lot of context to it. A trope can kind of go either way, and an archetype is just like a pattern that is repeated. So it's like,
one of the good examples I saw of archetype actually came from the short fiction class at Grossmont when I took that. I wish I could remember the name of my fellow student who wrote this story, but he wrote this little story about a cabbie from India who had immigrated to America, and all of the characters in it were archetypes, but it didn't end up really mattering too much that they were all archetypes and there wasn't that much depth to them, because really the heart of the story was this success story of an immigrant coming to America, first generation, finding success with his small business and being able to, provide a future for his children. So the benefit of an archetype is that even though it's not as strong as a fully fleshed out character, it still provides enough that people can easily connect to it. And trope, I think, like what you're saying, trope kind of sits in that middle ground somewhere between archetype and cliche, where it can have that same effect as an archetype, but if it's overused and you're not careful with it, it can very easily become cliche, which are all those things that are so overused that everyone's just sick of them. You start the beginning of the movie and you wake up, it was all a dream. You've got the well, I mean, I guess the farm boy hero is still more of a trope than a cliche at this point, but it wish-washes back and forth between the two so much.
If you don't give it enough depth, it becomes a cliche.
That's a good way of putting it, yeah.
So if you give the character more, like, depth of who they are, then they're not a cliche, they're an archetype. But you can have the same, like, idea of, like, the farm boy hero, and he could be, it's like, I don't know the character's name in Aragon. Is it Aragon? Is that his name? I didn't read the book.
Aragon, I think, was the name of the dragon.
Okay.
I just call him Medieval Luke because he basically is Medieval Luke Skywalker.
Exactly. So, like, his character was really, like, empty and bland and blank. So he's really a cliche.
Yeah.
But, like, Luke, I would call an archetype.
Yeah.
He seems like a real guy. Like,
he started as the archetypical reluctant hero. And, throughout the course of the first Star Wars movie, that's what we got. He was your archetypical farm boy hero who had the one thing he was good at, which was piloting starships. And everything else he was pretty crap at. And he had to learn to become better throughout the movie. And then as we go into the other two movies after that, Empire and Jedi, we see him grow out of that shell of an archetype and become a fully realized, fully fleshed out character that we can connect with, because now he's not just doing the standard farm boy thing. We're seeing him struggle. We're seeing him learn. He's still following the hero's journey farm boy archetype, but he's also pushing past those bounds. Cliche works in the opposite direction, where you take those bounds and you're just kind of locking them around you even tighter so that nothing else gets in.
Yeah, and it's also like sometimes playing with an archetype or a trope is fun because you can like turn it on its head where people like expect it to go one way. Like,
especially,
Princess Bride, they have the farm boy archetype, but he's not really much of a farm boy. He's like, I don't know, he's just really he's also a pirate, and he's
and
like,
not just
he doesn't take it like it's not taken as seriously, so it's more like it's playing with the idea of what you expect but doing something else with it.
And that would be something kind of interesting to consider too, is the type of story your character is in. Is it a comedy versus tragedy? That's going to affect their growth and their arc as well. Princess Bride, for example, the dread pirate Roberts, who we then find out is actually the dread pirate Wesley. It's hilarious to find out that, he took the name of the previous guy because he thought, well, Wesley sounds stupid. No one's going to be scared of that. It's hysterical, but at the same time, it's very good character development because we see too, Wesley at this point when he became the Dread Pirate, granted this is in his past, but we get that sense of he's not as confident in himself as he plays up, which then comes around later in the movie when he gets captured by the Six-Fingered Man and is being tortured and he breaks. We see, he's not exactly the cool, confident guy he fully plays himself up as.
That's like a character he's playing.
Yeah, he's playing that up. The character himself is playing the trope of, a dread pirate. And, he's good at playing that trope, but once the curtain falls away, you see, no, he's more talented, he's a lot smarter, and he is, skilled and dangerous in his own right, but he is ultimately still that kid Wesley who really wanted to be with Buttercup.
I think that's really relatable too, like that vulnerability in a character. Because a lot of times you'll read a book where or see a movie where there's like a character who's so like impenetrable and they're just so perfect in everything they do. And it's nice to see that like vulnerability, because real people are vulnerable.
Yeah, and that's something that I know that a lot of the big pop culture films lately have been struggling with. Star Wars has been struggling with that with the new movies. Marvel now, because of Captain Marvel, has been struggling with that because these characters are just immediately so perfect that there's nowhere else left for them to go. And that's a common thing in tabletop games that I've seen a lot of players will struggle with. Well, they'll come up with this idea and write this story about this character that is so perfect and so strong right from the get-go, from the first level. And granted, even at level 1, a character that a player is playing is in many ways a cut above your average person in these worlds. They are the kind of person who is strong enough and skilled enough in what they do to be able to go out and do dangerous things like raid dungeons filled with monsters. But a level 1 character is still not experienced. Yet I will see all the time people make characters at first level and go on about how they're a grizzled war veteran. Okay, how? And why aren't you just letting yourself experience this in the game? You shunting it, again, it's kind of shunting everything into the backstory means that you have cut off the point at which the character can grow. You've already decided they're at this point, they're a badass, you're just kind of trying to fulfill a power fantasy at that point. And that's fun for a little while, but it wears tired very fast.
It doesn't give you anywhere to go.
Exactly. It doesn't
That's
give
kind
any
of where
place to...
you get like a, why am I forgetting the character's name? What's the nerdy character in Harry Potter who like becomes like really
Ron?
heroic? No.
Neville?
Neville.
Yeah.
Neville versus Harry, like syndrome.
Yeah.
Because Neville like showed the most growth from the beginning of the story to the end of the story because he had enough space at the beginning to keep growing. Yeah. Whereas Harry kind of reached a point of like growth at a certain place. He reached and he just kind of stayed.
He reached a plateau. I think I didn't read through the full series. I watched like most of the movies, but I didn't read through the full series. And part of the reason is by the 4th book, I realized Harry was already reaching the plateau, and there wasn't really much else that he was going to do beyond this in terms of personal growth. It's the good stuff.
Yeah, it burns a little.
This is nice wine. This is coming from somebody who isn't really the biggest fan of wine either. But yeah, one does sometimes kind of wonder, you know, what would that story have been like if Neville was the central character? And I think it, you know, as talented a writer as Rowling is, um, or at least was, I haven't been as big a fan of the more recent stuff she's been doing, especially with the wild retconning she's been doing of a lot of her stuff. A lot of people have not been happy with her about. Um, but I do have to wonder if, like, you know, how much more interesting the story would have been if it focused on Neville instead of Harry. But
they kind of play with that idea in the book too, where they're like, it could have been his prophecy just as much, but
that's interesting.
Voldemort believed that it was Harry's, and so it became Harry's prophecy. Like that's a plot development.
That's kind of interesting, sort of playing on the idea of, you know, a self-fulfilled prophecy in an actual prophecy.
Yeah.
That's a pretty neat idea. I kind of like that. But yeah, that's something else that kind of becomes a bit of a problem when you have, speaking of, you know, something like Harry Potter, where halfway through the series, you know, the character is plateaued and doesn't really grow that much beyond that. Just things kind of happen around him and he just reacts to the plot as opposed to being the driving force in it. And then by contrast, you have those stories such as Game of Thrones, where you have lots of character growth, and the show pares this down a lot in terms of the number of characters. But in the books, you've got like multiple, like between 7 and 12 characters per book, each doing their individual arcs. And as characters are killed off, new ones are introduced, introducing new arcs, which is interesting and relatable to the historic basis of the book, which was the War of the Roses and similar conflicts across Europe during the Middle Ages. But at a certain point, it just becomes overwhelming when you go through 7 books and you're still being introduced to new characters in each book who have their own individual arcs and their own stories, who are probably just going to end up getting killed because, let's face it, Martin has a thing for murdering his characters. I kind of suspect he might be a murder hobo.
I definitely don't kill all my characters.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with killing off all of your characters. I'll say that now. It can definitely lead to good growth.
But I used to kill the animals for some reason. If there's an animal in my book, it's going to die.
Well, if you're looking to get an easy heart wrench out of someone, that's a quick way to do it. People tend to care a lot more when the dog dies than when even the kid dies in movies. There was it reminds me, actually, there was a joke that came out when the most recent God of War game came out, I think about 2 years ago now, where people were going on about the fact, oh, the main character Kratos, there's this kid with him. There was an online joke betting pool that went on about how fast that kid would die. And to my knowledge, he doesn't. I haven't played the game yet, but everyone was just kind of saying like, oh, look, there's a kid in this game that's known for being really dark and a bit edgy, taking all bets on when he dies for plot development.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. Hopefully, if you are working on a character, whether for a novel or a tabletop game, or maybe both, you have gotten some information on where to start.
Yeah. We totally didn't go over the recording time, I swear. This isn't sudden for any reason other than the fact that it's edited this way.
Yeah, it was an artistic decision.
Yeah, let's go with that. Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Yeah, this was fun. For those interested, my name is Dave Brandenburg, also known as GM Dave. Channel is the man behind the screen. If you're interested in tabletop gaming, role-playing videos, things like that, character breakdowns based on the point of view of someone who's looking to make an interesting role-playing character, you can find me on YouTube. I'm also on BitChute. Most of my videos are backed up there as well. You can also find me on Facebook, Twitter, Minds, and Gab.com.
All right. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.